in search of soil. All right, so Randy, what initially got you into the composting business?
Well, uh, I was a landscaper and I had a design and build business, probably one of the first ones that was environmentally conscious in Los Angeles. And I had trained with a bunch of great old guys who, were incredible at what they did, but they really weren't too into the environment at that point. And back in the early 80s, we had customers starting to ask us about natural and holistic landscaping, which to these guys was like, what? What are they talking about? So I had a lot of people that were putting me in charge of these projects, and a lot of guys I served with were agents at film businesses, companies, and management companies, and I started getting a lot of entertainment clientele, and these guys were asking for this kind of stuff, and so I ultimately realized that we had no good compost. There was not good soil out there. There was just the stuff you could pick up in bulk at the soil yards. And I realized that I had to find a different solution. And I ended up meeting a guy named Alan York, who was at Benziger Vineyards, and he was an incredible biodynamic vintner. And he kind of turned me on to really good compost. The first time I put my hand in his compost versus all the stuff I'd used for years as a landscaper, it was I literally paused, held this compost in my hand, felt the life in that thing, and I had this overwhelming sense of your life is about to change. And I had no idea what that meant at the time, but it was a huge thing. That those kind of things that like stop you in your tracks. I'm looking at this incredible compost pile, a finished, beautiful, which I didn't even really know what biodynamic was at that point, compost. And I'm just going, and he had a big grin on his face, like, gotcha.
What is it about good compost versus poor compost? And I think we could use maybe a tomato as an analogy. A lot of people, they picture tomatoes for that store-bought, hard, dense, lack of flavor tomato, and then they taste a real tomato and they see, wow, what a difference. If you think about that in compost, the stuff that you were had available at the soil yards, what visually and what maybe even physical properties did you not like about that, and why was seeing Alan such a mind blower?
When you look at compost that you can go get at a soil yard, or mostly like what's in a bag, what we have all historically seen as compost in America, it looks very woody and very fibrous in its makeup. It doesn't look like soil. It doesn't look like something that's really broken down. It doesn't have that quality or that characteristic. So just like when you go to a store and you see one of those kind of fat, pinky red tomatoes at, a conventional market, you look at it and you go, that just doesn't look right. Versus if you go out into my backyard or your backyard and take one of our heirloom tomatoes as it's ripening on the vine and you go, now that looks like a tomato. So when I saw Alan's compost and I saw that it was finished, and even though at that point he didn't screen the compost, but the breakdown and the consistency where it looked much more like soil with very fine particulate of some wood or some straw, but you could barely make out like really, you know. Whereas what I do is I take it another step further. I screen compost now really fine so that it looks almost like in some instances, coffee grounds. You can still see, and compost is different from our California farms and Oregon farms, but I'm looking for something that looks much closer to something that resembles soil instead of resembles mulch.
Yeah, and I've had that experience down here. We have a municipal soil yard, and I've gotten compost there in the past. And I was going to say, like, it definitely looks more like mulch than compost. Why is that you see that in a lot of municipal yards? Why are you seeing the coarser, chunkier materials in there?
It's because of what their inputs are, and then also what they're doing in terms of the composting itself. So even though they have standards that they have to adhere to in terms of pathogen reduction, I don't feel like in municipal composting that we're getting the kind of breakdown of the material that we really need. And the other thing for me, which gets into a whole other world, are levels of toxicity, because there's not testing for that. And there's not testing for GMOs, and there's not testing for a lot of stuff that I think is important. So when you can do a compost at home, and you can control your inputs, and you can, and even if you do a thermophilic or you do a static pile, if you're doing static, you can let that go for 8 months, 10 months, a year. And at the bottom of your compost bin or your compost pile, have something that's actually amazing that does resemble soil. Whereas I just think that when you have on mass scale a turnover of material that you have to turn over and turn over and turn over, and there's that you're under the gun all the time to get this stuff done and create new room and new space and get this stuff out. And so I've seen some really bad compost on, unfortunately, at school school gardens and community gardens and stuff, where I've gone like, honestly guys, that's not something that I would personally use. I would prefer you guys compost yourself, and then learn to vermicompost, do some other composting. And if you have to augment that compost, get a decent compost to inoculate your compost with.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the green waste that ends up at the yard by us where they make that compost. And a lot of those inputs are woodier type materials, tree prunings. And if you think about the process of breaking those down, even if you grind them up fine, you need fungi, which means time. And no amount of turning is really going to speed up the breakdown of the woody materials. And you're right, when you have an inventory management problem where the flow basically keeps coming in because you have a government contract to take all their tips, where do you put it at the end of the day? So is it just sending it back out the door finished? It's almost like that compost you get has to be recomposted when you get it before it becomes effective.
Well, it's what you said too. It also then, when you put it into your yard, let's say you take that compost, then what you're asking the biology in your soil to do is work on breaking that down. And then also when you look at that kind of stuff, so if you're going to do that re-breakdown that you're talking about, which is correct, what is the nutrient density of that material? What kind of breakdown are you going to get when the microbes mineralize, that material? So I'm always looking also for really good, clean, organic matter that, once you do a soil analysis on it, and you can see like, hey, what is my nutrient spectrum, on this? Do I have all the majors? Do I have the minors? Where am I? I think a lot of stuff that doesn't, and then you get stuff that's sprayed too. So you get all kinds of, that whole type of thing too. So it gets very sticky in terms of if you're growing food, or if you've got somebody in your family who has cancer, or, a child, that has any kind of illness. And especially like, excuse me, in today's world where we have a lot of compromised immune systems, you got to be really careful, because I use that example. I think, we talked about it briefly, that I always have neighbors that love to spray Roundup, herbicides, pesticides. And what they do, unfortunately, is when their stuff, kicks the bucket, they clean it up, sweep it up, and it all goes into the green bin. That becomes part of what is in the green waste stream of compost. Not everybody does that. There's a lot of people that are conscious out there that, really grow organically or do their best to grow organically. But there's a lot of people that just take all that stuff and throw it in there. And if you're not composting correctly, you're not giving it enough time. You're not letting, and the tough part is, even with that stuff in there, until it gets into the soil, and you have the ability for the microbes to break stuff down and then flush that into the aquifer, you still have that toxin, that toxicity, that residue. And for me, that's a scary thing.
Yeah, this is a big thing in the composting world right now. I saw a video where I think it's like the National Composting Council is promoting, this removal of these persistent herbicides in compost. Do you think that's a pretty widespread problem with a lot of municipal compost? Like, would you bet that most of that, not most, but some of that compost is going to have persistent herbicide in it, and you're probably going to have problems if you bring that onto your property?
Absolutely. And if when you research and you look at stuff, of course, you see people that have said, I bought, a truckload in and I had this compost, I got a dump truckload and I was, so excited to spread it around my yard. And then all of a sudden you start to see different types of disease come that you never had before. You start to see in some of your food crops where stuff doesn't grow, seeds don't germinate, all kinds of stuff. I've heard a lot of horror stories, and not every place is a bad composting place. It depends on degree of inputs and depends on degree of consciousness of the operators. We did a thing. Oh, I think 2 or 3 years ago now for the National Composting Council, and in downtown Los Angeles. And they had us come because we have a real broad spectrum of people that use Malibu Compost. And they wanted us to talk about using compost to grow cannabis because they thought it was going to be a cash cow. And the room was packed. You couldn't fit another body in there, which is great. But people really thought, okay, and there was a lot of big players in the composting world were there. And what we talked about was exactly what you and I are discussing right now. How do you eliminate those things that we don't want to get into people's bodies and that we don't want to get into people's lungs and we don't want that to get in people's guts? And everybody was kind of like, I think there was a lot of excitement and the air kind of dropped out of the room because we hit them with a dose of really heavy reality. So I think a lot of these guys knew what we were talking about and knew that, wow, to do that is going to cost us a ton of dough to fix this problem. So they know.
Yeah. Hey, what are your thoughts on this? Somebody has access to municipal compost or soil yards compost, and maybe it's not the best. Let's say yours is a 10 out of 10 and somebody finds a 6 out of 10. They might not know what's in it. It doesn't look fully broken down. They need quantity. So they need volume, and they're trying to start soils off. Do you think in the beginning, subpar compost is better than no compost or better than less compost, or you're better off spending money and using less?
Yeah, this is a tough one for me because I don't want to come off like I'm, in any way elitist about our compost or arrogant about our compost or whatever that we do. We make farm-made compost, and we're very particular about what we do. I always, in the classes I teach on gardening and the stuff that I talk about, I'm always telling people I would rather have you start out with something really good and then have to fix problems down the road that sometimes using bad compost or bad soil can create, especially for novice gardeners that haven't seen a lot of problems. We have a lot of brand new gardeners now since the whole COVID thing, and I would hate to see them get into a situation where they're like, oh wow, man, this is just way harder. This is not what I set out to do. I thought it was going to be really fun and great and good for my family and whatever. So I think people are better off starting in small doses. And if they've already created a garden and they did it in a way that might have some toxicity in it or whatever, utilize some of the people that are out there that can talk about how do you remediate soil? What do you do? What are some of the ways? Because a lot of times people get scared when I say, hey, there's toxins in soil. There's, do you know why we test for GMOs? When I go down, I run down this list and people get very scared. And I go, here's the good news. The biology, if you feed the biology in your soil, it's going to remediate these problems. And if you keep on it and you start using flushes and compost teas and things that are not historically, what every garden center or garden expert will teach you, you're going to be okay. And then they kind of relax with that, because otherwise I'm a person, I don't want to just keep perpetuating the same problem, which is saying like, oh yeah, buy the cheap stuff and, throw a little bit of our compost in there and fix it. If you can just, work with your soil that you have and add compost to it, or take a really basic mix. If our potting soil is too expensive for somebody, you can get You can get some different bales of core or peat, add some perlite into those things, add some castings, add our compost at a different ratio, like at 25% for your organic matter, and start building some soil in your beds and start feeding, start top dressing a lot with compost, start adding your teas, start, adding some mineral, especially like in the raised beds, because we need to kind of mimic nature there. So I always say, I try to start out with what's good. And when people ask me, what do you do? This is what I do. It's how I do it.
One thing I found interesting, and I hadn't thought about this before, and this might be a lot of gardeners and growers where we think a lot of, I mean, we'll look at the package that we're eating of something, we look at the ingredients and we go through it and say, oh, what did they add here? And we kind of assume like there's no toxins in there. Like the food system has made sure there's no lead and bad stuff in there. But when it comes to a lot of garden amendments, I think a lot of people are pouring and dumping with kind of blind faith, even if it's organic even if it's compost, they're not thinking about what could be in there. But you guys run toxicology reports on your compost. Why do you feel that's important? And do you think outside of pesticides, there's other potential toxins out there in compost that people can buy?
Yeah, good question. We run toxicology panels looking for the compounds that are found in pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, just because we're in farming areas where we make our compost. And even though the farms around us are organic and we're in no spray zones, you never know. There's drift can, go far, depending on what's going on. And we started testing because of that, to make sure that what we were putting in the bag, was clean. So our tests for the 10 years have been wonderful, and what that does, it allows us to relax and know that what we're bagging is good. And then on the other side, we're the only soil company that I know of that tests for GMOs. And we test for GMOs. We run genetic IDs because in a lot of that stuff that people buy, especially in terms of fertilizers, I know a lot of gardeners that I've met that they love their, bone meal, blood meal, feather meal, cottonseed meal. Especially on the bone meal, blood meal, and feather meal, I don't use it because the animals that is sourced from are fed GMO feedstocks, and those GMO feedstocks, corn, soy, alfalfa, are all sprayed with glyphosate. And that residue gets into, I don't care what they do, it gets into it. And you see it, it's in all kinds of products, and that's why we even see it in food stuff that we buy, packaged food things, like they had the whole thing with, I think it was a couple of General Mills foods that had, glyphosate residue in it. And it's been all over the place. So for me, I tell gardeners, hey, if you're growing organic, then you don't need those things. Look at, if you top dress a lot, if you add other things, there are things that you can add to mineralize, and you can get away from these things that historically everybody's been told to use, because they do have levels of toxicity in them. And no one's testing. I mean, we test, but I don't know anybody else that tests.
I mean, one of the things you use as a main input in the compost is manure. It's coming from an organic farm. And we were talking about this yesterday of the organic standards are kind of crazy in the sense of you can have conventional manure go through a composting process, come out the other end, and it's organic compost. If you look past the regulations, what are your thoughts on using manure out of a conventional system in compost? Do you think the composting process is dealing with those residues, or I'm thinking based on the whole toxicology thing, like it's not okay?
I personally feel like you're getting a lot of stuff in conventional compost that, if you're buying conventional compost and it's not organic, you're kind of getting what you figure you're getting, right? Where it gets tricky for me is when stuff is labeled organic, and that's when people, because it says organic across the bag or with a little thing on there, little stamp on there or whatever, people think, oh, it's tested, it's safe, it's fine, I'm all good. And that's how I believe it should be. But unfortunately, it's not, because there's different levels of organic and organic certification in this country, and even just different levels of how different certifiers even check on companies that are making stuff labeled organic to see if it is. So a lot of times conventional waste will get into the organic stream. And, for me, I guess I just have become more of a purist over time. And I think also, I look at my own family, I look at myself, and I look at like how we try to utilize growing healthy food, eating healthy food. We try to not have poisons in our gardens. And I was around a lot of poison growing up, being a landscaper, and I think, and I've had some different tests and stuff done on me, and my exposure was a little scary, and I've had to do a lot of things to fix some stuff in my body about that. So I'm even a little bit more hesitant to just say, oh, go ahead and use it, because I've already had some things happen because of being around toxins.
I mean, as a business owner, somebody producing compost, when it comes to business, there's a bottom line. Would it be financially beneficial for you to take conventional manure if you could? Like, can you get more of that cheaper than you can organic manures?
Yeah, typically how that works is for companies that they get paid tipping fees to take stuff away from from conventional farms. And then you get that product for free. Whereas the way we work it is we, on our farm in Oregon, we're across the street from an organic valley dairy and one down the street from us. And what we do is we supply them with wood chips that we buy from the Forest Service that they use in the loafing sheds for the cows to sleep on. It's comfortable. It drops the incidence of mastitis with the cows. It's a very holistic animal care program, which is great. So for us, there's a cost. It costs us money. And then we have the cost of bringing the manure, in across the street from our farm and doing the manure management that way on our property. In California, we compost on the site, so there's some of that trucking fee that's out of there. But for us, as a business, as a person, I'm the CEO of Malibu Compost, and I'm the person that started it with my other partners. I don't think that cutting corners or saving money. We make a premium product, which is a real premium. You hear that word premium, and it means a lot of times it's crap, but it's called premium. We make what I consider the best compost you can buy in a bag. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy, and it takes 6 months before our stuff actually, at a minimum, gets put down, gets composted, goes through the thermophilic phase, and then gets screened and bagged and shipped off. For me, it's not so much about the money. It's about doing the right thing. Yeah. And that's kind of how our whole company feels, and how our board of directors feels, and all of us. We feel like if we do the right thing, at every turn. And we've had lots of opportunities where people have said like, hey, come in and compost our conventional waste and put preps in it. And we're like, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to bastardize the process. We're going to do what we do, and either people are going to accept it and go with us, or they're going to reject us, which is what I love about the free market system.
It's along the similar lines of tipping fees and potentially questionable inputs. What are your thoughts on compost made with biosolids?
Wow. Not a fan. Not a fan. There's just we have in a country where prescription drug use is massive, and in a country where people eating diets of horrific food, fast foods, and all kinds of stuff, and in a place where even if you're going to use that and they sterilize it, then what do you have? To me, I get it, but it just seems
Doesn't
I don't
jive
know.
with your ethos of who you are.
No, not
Yeah.
not at all. And I think, and the problem is when you put stuff out there, there's companies that use that and put it out and everything like that, and people think, oh, it's okay. We all have different experiences. In my view, if you're in a jungle and you're doing pits and you're doing, and you're living, having a pretty clean diet, and or you're in somewhere that you're out on a farm where you're eating what you grow, um, that it changes the spectrum. But when you're living in, a modern society where people fix a lot of stuff or try to with drugs and and have historically bad diets over the last 50 years or 40 years, I mean, there's a lot of variables that you can't control with that.
Yeah. Similarly, what about manures? You use dairy manure, so it's coming from cows. Do you think all animal manures are created equal? Would you derive any benefit from getting other organic manures blended in?
Well, we use the organic dairy cow manure because for us, we have to use that in our biodynamic production that we do. It's also a really good clean source, and those animals, because we run the genetic IDs, we know the grasses and hays and even corn that they're eating, where it's grown, where it comes from, how it comes back, and how it tests. So we follow the inputs. But there's a lot of other animals that I think, alpaca, sheep, goat, great manures. Rabbit manure can be great. Um, Chicken manure, if you're, controlling their inputs, what they're eating, if they're using an organic mash, or you get, eating your vegetables with, an organic mash out of the garden, great stuff. But the problem is you get into other things where I have a lot of friends that I've owned horses, and people are like, oh, I've got, horses, or I've got, horse down the street or whatever. And horses, for me, my horses, I always had to worm them. And I used ivermectin, and ivermectin is a flagell. It's an antifungal, so not good in their gut. And also, a lot of horses, depending on what happens, they get put on a lot of different antibiotics. I had a couple of my horses that were very susceptible to different illnesses, and treating them holistically didn't work. So we had to go the antibiotic route. And so for me, I'm not a big horse manure fan. I'm not a big bag chicken manure fan because of where it comes from. I definitely never use steer manure because of where it comes from, and also it has really high ammonia levels and can have high concentrations of salt in it. So, but other things, if you're, I have a lot of friends, and we, on our farm in Oregon, we have different parts of the farm. We've got guys that have sheep, running around. We've got some goats on the farm. They're great. The goats are hysterical. We keep them out of our compost area, but in the areas that are there where they are, they're great, and they use those manures to grow some of the stuff that they're growing crop wise on the farm.
Yeah, along the lines of salts, that's a good point. Do you experience any issues with that using dairy manure? And is that something you have to rectify on your end through the process?
No, we don't, because of what the cows are eating. Basically, we're getting a really they're we don't have the salt issue that you get with the different feeds that animals eat in the confined animal systems. So we don't have high salt content in our compost, and I never have.
Now, I know you're making biodynamic compost, so the manure part kind of comes part and parcel with that by definition. But if you didn't have to be biodynamic, do you think that manure is a critical input to making good compost? There's some people that believe it is, and then you get this other side that is kind of that veganic route. They want just plant-based compost that was never near any manure. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, we have a lot of vegans that reach out to us. I'm a vegetarian. I'm not a vegan. Um, I personally believe that I make a lot of green waste compost on different farms, different urban farms, different larger scale farms. At our own home farm, I do that. And what I always find is I don't feel that I get quite the kick that I'm looking for um, from a straight compost that's green waste. So I find myself adding. I'll supplement with rock dust. I supplement with sometimes I do a lot of we do castings at our house, and we do them at some other farms that we work on and consult on. I'll add castings, which even some people that are veganic are like anti-casting. So that's I've heard that side of the argument too. So but for me, I always find that adding a little bit of compost to your mixes, and I do for my soil mixes, I go that old school 25 to 33% good organic matter, like a finished compost. I might have a combination of 25 or 28% compost, and then 3% or 5% castings. But that's my base. That's always a base component. But I feel like it making good green waste compost too, especially where you can control the inputs. You're basically reinoculating with the biology that's on your property back into the soil, and it works really, really great. And I've had people that have done that very successfully. For me, I always find that, especially some of my heavier feeders like tomatoes and other things like that, where you've got stuff that on my food crops, a lot of the time, I feel like they have such a initial hit because the uptake of nutrient is so quick and so strong. Most of them are short crops, and they have a short time span, that they're spent producing. That I feel like I get a better result with adding some manures, composted manure into my mix.
Along the lines of nutrients within compost, do you provide like a soil analysis on the compost where you get NPK, those types of values? And do you think somebody who's buying compost should always ask for that? Are most bulk composting makers going to have that data available so you know what you're actually getting and adding?
That's a tricky one because we don't put NPK on our compost because I register it as an amendment and not as a fertilizer. We run a ton of soil analysis, so I know what nutrients are in there, and I know what minerals are in there. They don't allow you to post your results on your website and use it because they consider it a marketing material. And so there's a whole issue where the government tries to control guaranteed results, and it's really tricky. So this is an area where a lot of times, if you happen to know the company, I don't, as a habit, just shoot out test results to people. I want to know, who are you? What are you doing? What do you need to know? Is there something I can translate to you? So sometimes it's about trusting who's making the compost that you're buying. Is there a dialogue? Is there an openness about it? I get all kinds of stuff where I get people like, yeah, can you send me all your analysis on your compost? And I'm like, and who are you? And why do you need this analysis? And what are you looking for? Because maybe, and how familiar are you with different types of labs, so that maybe I can, because I get a lot of people from the classes I teach at nurseries and stuff on organic gardening, people that are even master gardeners and master composters. They send me all kinds of questions about compost, and also even when I recommend to people you test your soil, they hit me up with a zillion questions on, hey, what am I looking at? What do I need here? This tells me I should put down all this lime. Would you do that? And I'm like, absolutely not. And we get into a dialogue. So The testing part of it is tricky. Everybody should test. And if somebody has specific questions, you should be able to answer that fairly easily. But a lot of companies just do the basic bare minimum, to get through whatever the standard is.
So I know compost is, I think it's even typically viewed as an amendment, not a fertilizer by most users. But I don't want to get you in trouble. I mean, given your experience, do you think that most well-made composts are going to have a few percent NPK in them? Are they going to have like point something percent? Are they going to have over 5? Like, how much fertilizer kick do you think a good compost would have in it? Is it enough there to even think of it like a fertilizer, or you having seen all the tests, it's there, but yeah, it's an amendment?
I guess the best way to answer that, which is a great question, you're not going to get me in trouble. But um, I look at it like we're on these farms and we're on some really big properties and we're on some, let's say even a 10-acre parcel, right? Which is a lot bigger than most people are gardening on at home. Okay. Or even, small farms. A lot of them are 5 acres or less. We don't use any fertilizers. We use compost. We use compost tea. Occasionally I'll use an organic alfalfa mush. Occasionally I'll use a little bit of liquid kelp that's really good from North Atlantic. And sometimes I'll use some different mine minerals. And that's it. Pretty much. That's pretty much it. I know if I ever need, some additional biology to break stuff down because I've got a good source to mineralize from, I might add a little bit of EM1. I might add, there's a product that I love called Rootwise Soil Dynamic, which is another great inoculant. So I'm always looking for the biological additives, which a good finished compost should be a great biological additive or amendment. And that's where we go back to what we were starting to talk about earlier. The more broken down it is, the more complex it gets in terms of breakdown and in terms of how much time it's had to actually get a diversity of biology in it, the better it's going to be as an amendment because it'll do what you want it to do and it'll do what nature does in nature.
I think it's safe to say, based on that there is some fertilization value in good compost. You're feeding the microbes. But on the flip side, compost can be also a bad thing. It can be an anti-fertilizer if it's unfinished. And I've heard some horror stories from growers who have added poor compost to their soil and had very poor results because now what nutrition they did have in the soil is being used by the microbes to break down the compost that they added. I mean, do you think this is also a big problem with unfinished or poor quality compost, is sometimes you are doing more harm than good?
Yeah, I think that any time that we make the soil work harder than it has to, it's the same thing with most people don't think about this or talk about it, but there is a stress on the soil, on the biology when you add stuff in there that's not finished or maybe has toxins, something that could kill off biology. Adding stuff also that leaches even moisture out of there, that the microbes need to survive and thrive, So a lot of times when you have woody stuff too, it really sucks moisture, out of the soil. Sometimes if you're not on top of your watering game, which is a huge problem for a lot of people, there's just a lot of different things that can happen by using unfinished compost versus using a finished compost. And I always tell people, even at home, get a screen, screen that stuff, make a little, 3x3 screen at home and screen your own compost that you're taking out of the bottom of your bin. And then you take the spoils and throw them back in there and, keep that going to inoculate. But try to get your compost as fine as you can in terms of particulate and sieve size so that it can do the most good as quickly as possible.
Is that why you guys screen? Like you just don't want it to have the chance of leaving unbroken down stuff in there, and just to have it more bioavailable. Smaller means more surface area.
Yeah, good question. our stuff is like, I mean, when I say it's 100% finished, because we go through the thermophilic phase, so we have that portion where you're between 131 and 160, for 15 days. We generally well exceed that, but which is great in terms of what's going on. But so our stuff is actually completely processed, and then as it goes through the breakdown period, when it comes out of a bacterial phase, which is that phase where it's hot and starts to cool down, and then the breakdown happens, you get to a point where once the temps are 80 degrees, 90 degrees, even 100, you get other biology that comes up into our compost piles, and we just kind of let them sit when they get to that phase. We're screening because you still will always have certain amounts of some wood particulate that might be on the crust of the windrows, and since they're long windrows, we're screening that to make sure we're screening everything out. And the other thing too is, as you're doing the turning process, we try to not disturb the windrows too much. So we use our compost turner to turn, and you'll get stuff. When for us, we're farm made, so you'll get things like occasionally some baling wire that will pull out, or the twine that's used, on bales of hay, that kind of stuff, depending on the season when it is, and we pull that stuff out. We're also screening to get any of those types of things out. You'll even get occasional, a tag from one of the cows that, falls off and it's there, or you'll get, we do on the farm in Oregon, we do a lot of acupuncture on the cows. And, so the same kind of acupuncture needles that they use on us, there's it's a little bit bigger than what they use on us, but we use them. And occasionally, the vet really tries to do a great job and trying to get all that stuff, whereas, out of there. But like in conventional farming, they literally come down and just keep shooting and then just dropping the needles. And you're like, whoa, so we're trying to screen to get as much of all of those imperfections out, and we go through the windrows kind of every day and just pull stuff out. There might even be some plastic that blew, from the guys, covering stuff or whatever, and it blows into where we take stuff off the separator, and we're constantly cleaning stuff up and refining that process, but we're screening to make sure that you have that small particulate. We use an 1/8 inch screener and really try to make it so that you are getting just straight, beautiful, clean compost to work in your yard.
Yeah, I have a bag of it here that I was just making some tea with, and it is really fine, nice texture. And I've compared that against some other brands of that make things like Amend, and you look at that, and that stuff is much coarser, chunkier. So I do really love the texture that you guys have. In terms of the process, what are your thoughts on this? So the initial turning is obviously a bacterial phase because they're eating up all the food that bacteria can eat, the kind of lower, less mature carbon. And then you need to let it sit to let the fungi get in there, proliferate, expand, and break down some of the more mature carbon in the pile. If you look at the lifespan of compost going from 0 to day when it's deemed finish, how much of that is turned aerobic, and then how much of that is just letting that pile, quote, cure, letting the fungi get in there, not just to break it down, but also because that's what you're trying to do with compost. You're trying to get bacteria and fungi to breed out, so you're inoculating your soil.
Yeah, great question. It also depends. Seasonality, depending on the farm, is also really important with us because you have moments where you have, in Oregon, it could rain 130 days a year, where our farm is. We've had some seasons that have been that much rain. So there, you're trying to, we do some other different things, as we finish stuff off. There are ways to, work with the weather. We use really nice Compost Tech compost covers. They're things that we do, but really that after that, and that also deals with temperature. So that after that initial heat up, right now, for example, we just built 3 windrows yesterday in Oregon. Temperatures are already coming up. I would imagine we'll have to turn those probably by Monday or Tuesday, we'll be up in the mid 130s. And I like to get that all that raw material into a nice form where it actually starts to really get into that thermophilic phase. So in the summertime and in the late spring, our composting cycle on the thermophilic phase is much quicker than it is in the wintertime when it's wet and it's cold. Sometimes it takes a while for all of that material to, once you pull it off of the separators, to kind of reform, get back into a shape where all of a sudden it starts to heat up again. So it just takes different periods of time depending on the cycle. And for us, we know pretty much once we've gone through our 15-day, pathogen reduction, and we start to look and see, okay, are the temps hovering at 128 after they've been through the 135, 140 cycle? Are they hovering at 128? Great. They're still in thermophilic. Even if they're down to 125, 120, then is where you start seeing that kind of that breakdown of a little bit more finer material. And then as you drop down to 110, 100, you really start to see the compost inside the shell of the outer layer of the compost, or if there's a compost tech cover on it, and then the shell, you start to really see how it starts to break down, as you were discussing, in much finer particulate. And it's just interesting to watch. So sometimes our stuff in the winter might take 8 months to finish if it's a particularly wet winter. And sometimes in the summer, 6 months is the mark. We've had stuff where, because we have so much heat and a fair amount of moisture, because you don't want stuff to get too dry either, that becomes that completely retards the process. But we've had stuff in 5 months, which you go like, wow, that was an amazingly quick, for us, quick process. But for a lot of people, when you're getting the kind of woody stuff, they're in and out in 4 weeks to 8 weeks, and it's not having that time.
Is there if you're selling compost, is there some sort of regulation that deems this is what finished compost must be? No. So like you can do whatever you want and call it compost.
What you have to do is there's certain inputs that you have to, that can be called compost. But you have to do you have to have a pathogen reduction on it if you're thermophilic composting. So they want to know that there's no E. coli, salmonella, listeria in it. They want to know a basic pH. They want to know, what's in there, and they want to know a very minor metals analysis. And that's really the baseline of testing. And I'm like, wow, that's just not a lot.
Which is, I guess that's kind of similar to a lot of agriculture in a way. Like there's no standard to say what a tomato is or when a avocado is ready. It comes down to knowing the company or knowing the grower, where some are like, hey, we're picking today, these got to go to market. And some are like, these just aren't ready yet. They're not perfect. We're not sending it until it's perfect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had that experience where with our distributors, we had one winter that was, we're in Oregon, our stuff for the Northwest, and it goes into Colorado and stuff. We had freezes and rain that was so intense right around the holiday time and then into the beginning of January that we had to literally take finished compost that was under covers because the water table had risen so much, and it was like it was sucking back into the compost, right? So I had to rent a bunch of barns from friends of mine around the area, and we literally were hauling compost that became soaking wet again, finished, to these barns. I put in giant industrial fans, and we took our loaders over there, and we would turn this stuff all the time to get it to start to dry out again. And man, that was, and I literally had to tell our distributors, I would shoot them a picture and say, guys, this is a lot of finished compost, and you're going to get it once the moisture content is where it needs to be, and once I feel comfortable bagging it. And I'm sorry for the delay, but that's the way it is. We're a farm-based compost company.
What about that moisture content? Is there a level that you think is right? And do you think there's potential exploitation of that? I know most compost is not being sold by weight, it's being sold by volume, but a lot of organic material expands when you get it wet. So, do you think that there's companies out there that maybe sell water in addition to compost?
No, I think what happens is like we'll get stuff, you want to have stuff that's 27, 28, 30% moisture content, which is a really good moisture content. But what happens is, depending on how people um, take care of the compost at the distributors and at the nurseries, if it's a wet time, they leave the bags out there. I'm always telling people, please cover the bags. Please cover your compost. Don't leave it out there just sitting out there on pallets, because it's going to absorb moisture. And we have little holes in the bags so that oxygen gets in there. And the other thing too is it draws moisture from, so like some of my stores that are by the coast, they literally are sucking moisture in all the time, out of the atmosphere. So I think people would prefer that it stayed pretty standard on a compost, because it makes it tough for people to pick up bags, and then there are times where people have left it out there in the summertime, where people ask me all the time, is it being in the sun going to kill the microbes in the compost? And I'm like, if the bag's not going to get over 160 degrees, you're not going to kill the beneficial bacteria that's in there. You're not going to kill it off. But if at the same time it's out there and it's 2 or 3 weeks of 110 degrees, or you're in Palm Springs, the moisture content can get to the point where you almost have dust in there, and at that point you can kill off biology big time.
When it, one thing I think about when I think about the growing industry, and I think the cannabis trend has pushed this a lot, is, and I'm envious of this as somebody who sells stuff, is the marketing on the bags of products of ag amendments is crazy. Like all sorts of drawings, artwork. I love it, but I also kind of hate it, because there can be a lot of claims puffery on there. Not everybody is going to be able to hear an interview with somebody who's a CEO of a company like you. So they're not going to know what goes into making their compost. If somebody's at a garden center or a hydroponic shop and you have a choice of soils and you have a choice of potting mixes and composts, the bags can make it sound amazing and sound great. How do you cut through the BS and really try and figure out if what is in the bag stands up to what's written on the bag?
Wow. That's a really that's a tough one. Okay, because a lot of times it's the pretty bag, Farmer Bill says, it's whatever. I always tell people in my classes, because we're in the information age, and I go, hey, how many of you guys are Googlers? And they all raise their hand, right? And I go, okay, so if you're all Googlers, and I even hate that I use that term, but it's what it is. It's where we are, I tell people to research the companies that they want to buy stuff from, and to not just buy the initial stuff that pops up, but look kind of through there and see if there's anything that either raises a red flag or that raises a flag where you go, wow, maybe this is a gold star, and you just kind of go follow that a little bit. I tell people, you don't have to be a black belt in Googling right away, but the more you research what you're going to do, the better. And you'll find those companies that you want to support and products that you believe in. We've been very fortunate because we're pretty open about stuff. And so we get a lot of people that direct message us, or they'll direct message me on my own Instagram, and my own Facebook, and I answer, and everybody in our company is very forthcoming with information. And we do a lot of, when we are able to, and hopefully once this is over, we'll get back to it. We do a lot of classes and we're out in the public a lot. So we actually get to talk to people, which a lot of companies, and we do it in a way where we're not trying to sell Malibu. When I go to a nursery, I just don't have a bunch of bags of Malibu compost up behind me and go like, here, buy my stuff. Thank you for coming. It's been nice knowing you. I'm there to talk about like what we're talking about, like what, And if somebody says to me, well, I like using this soil product and I've done it for years and I've had good results, but I want to get away from these chemical fertilizers. I'm like, okay, so I look at that as an opportunity to not hammer somebody and preach my message, but go, okay, let's try to see if I can bring this person a little bit further down the organic, line. And then, see if they have a good result with that. And if they do, then maybe suggest a few more things. And before you know it, they might be like me, a landscaper who used a lot of chemicals and fertilizers and stuff because that's what I was taught. And when I got to the other side of it, I could never go back to that ever, So I think the more research we do, and a lot of times I also tell people too, because this is an important piece to me. We've moved away from our intuition as a culture, as people. We've moved away from that sense that we go, this is right, this is wrong. This doesn't sound good. This feels right. And I tell people, trust that a little bit more. If you see something that it sounds too good to be true, then either do the research on it, call the company up, send them a message, or just sit with it for a second, put your hand on the bag or put your hand to the stuff with the bags open and go, is it? Isn't it? Do I really want this? And make that decision. Don't, I think I part of like gardening and being in the soil and getting biology all over you. And I love eating stuff without washing it in my garden and just getting that stuff in my gut, we become and it's funny, we're doing this on Skype, right? But, this interview, and we're on computers, but I try to tell people step back away from that and get back into who we really are, what we really are.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. I think that intuition part is huge. And I mean, here's something that comes out of my intuition is you're saying, a lot of people move from conventional to organic and they go from all these sprays and they try and get more organic. And I think there's a bit of a curse to that because you go in a nursery and good God, there is a lot of products available. I mean, the cereal box style amendments, there's 50 of them on the shelf. And I feel like people feel the need too much to just keep adding more and more stuff. And you see it on bags of amendments where, oh, it's not compost, it's compost plus mycorrhizae, plus a little bit of biochar in there, plus there's some azomite. And the list goes on and on and on. And I think people on the organic side get a little bit hooked on, I need 50 things to grow. And if I don't have this, then my soil's not going to be perfect. And I think a lot of these problems can be solved with just good quality compost and native soil and activating that biology. And what are your thoughts on this being in the sector? Do you think maybe there's too much promotion of stuff that, while maybe needed for some people in very specific contexts, isn't needed for most people in most contexts?
Yeah, I mean, I look at that as kind of all of us, I think, can become Rain Men, like the movie Rain Man. Like we could all walk near at 3:00. This is how we have to do it. Right. And we're told something and we hang on to that and want to do it forever. Right. And that may be, and even what you might need to do in the beginning to start to create some fertility and to create some stuff while your soil is doing what it needs to do to get going. But over time, when I'll give you an example. When we consult on projects, we get brought in a lot of times as consultants on soil consulting and on creating and setting organic protocols. A lot of times for some interesting sites we've had a chance to work on over the years. And I always do a 5-year plan with these guys where in the beginning, I may, depending on how toxic things were or how bad the soil was, I might add some of those things you were talking about and really do a bunch of compost teas that have a lot of different things in them to stimulate. But what we do is it's based all on using the compost and based all on us starting to teach these guys how to mimic nature And so in the 5-year plan, our customers are buying a lot less compost from us and buying a lot less stuff from us because they don't need it. Because when you start looking at their biological analysis of their properties, the soil is growing. And if you feed that soil, and if you continue to feed that soil and make good compost on the property, then you can become much more self-sufficient. And so my dad, who was a management consultant, probably would have said, like, what's wrong with you? That's a really horrible business model to tell people that at year 5 they don't need as much of your stuff. But that's the truth. If you're just, if we're mimicking nature, nature will start to take care of what's going on. And you look at compost. I'm always talking about, instead of adding a bunch of stuff, I just say, hey, why don't you top dress with a 16th of an inch of a finished compost, or your compost, or my compost, or why don't you, or if you need a little bit more, go an eighth of an inch, and then water it in. Every 3 weeks, I have people on their food gardens doing a compost tea, where they basically do a compost tea extraction. They don't have to aerate, they don't have to do anything, and basically they're watering, they're feeding their soil, and they're feeding their plants at the same time. And I have people, when they have problems, we go from real basic stuff like, did you compost? Did you do your tea? Did you add nematodes into your soil mix, when you started? Did you, what's your watering schedule look like? How's your sun exposure? How's your wind exposure? Just start with the basics before adding all this stuff. Keep it simple.
Along the lines of, like, if we're thinking insects in micro and macro flora in the soil, do you do any sort of microscope work with your finished compost? Again, I get you probably don't want to label that on the bag because it's not a guaranteed type thing, but do you feel that that's important to know in the finished compost that there are X levels of this, X levels of this, X levels of that?
Absolutely. We've been running biological analysis since day one, and I think it's important. In fact, my wife she was in Elaine Ingham's first class. She was the first soil food web consultant, one of the first, I think, in Los Angeles. There were 2 of them that were in that first class that Elaine did. And yeah, we're very much about looking at that. I think it's important to know, and I think a lot of companies don't do it, and they should. They should know what's in there. But again, I look at it more as I look at the whole true organic concept of growing, which includes, biodynamic, biological farming, regenerative ag. I look at a much more broad spectrum. So I don't think that the biological view is the only view. I think you want to look at the big picture instead of, but I think it's an important component of that.
Yeah. Well, biodynamics themselves, that can be a very polarizing form of agriculture. Some people are diehards. Some people think it's total woo-woo. You sell biodynamic compost. At the core, why did you feel that was important?
Well, I think in life, a lot of things are timing and where things are as you get exposed to different things, because none of us, walk into the world and know it all, right? And hopefully we're all learning as we progress over time. I always joke that in terms of my learning and growing and working and doing, I have a retirement plan. It's called death. And I hope that I'm doing, all these things until I take my last breath, So biodynamics for us, Alan York was an important bridge to that for us. And when I saw his compost and then started to look a little bit deeper into biodynamics and meet other biodynamic farmers, I was very interested, because at that point in time, it wasn't that well known in the United States, except to, the wine industry and a couple of other places. And I happened to meet a guy who became one of my co-founders of the company, who grew up on a biodynamic farm on the East Coast. And I found real value. And then I met some farmers that we started making compost. I started first before I met my partner at the time, and I started making compost with them on their farm in the Central Valley in California, and I got to see an incredible process, and I got to see that breakdown that became the impetus for us. And using the preparations was a really interesting launch point for me in terms of another point of growth. So, it's funny because I went to school in Los Angeles. The guy that began the company with me, he went to a Waldorf school, was completely a biodynamic devotee. I was much more that guy that was on the learning curve. And so the impact on me was different, than the impact was on him. But we just felt like it was the right thing to do. And when we came out, it was right after when we launched our company. In fact, it's 11 years this week, back on the 9th that we launched the company. And and it was right when the housing market had burst and the bubble had burst and people were broke. And it was a really crazy time if you remember back to that moment in time. And people were saying to us, like, you're insane. Like, no one's going to buy biodynamic compost. And at that point in time, I think stores were selling it for like $16 a bag. And they're like, no one's going to pay that. No one's going to do that. That's nuts, right? And we were like, thank you for sharing. Our instinct told us differently and told us that it wasn't going to be an easy road. But if you put it out there sometimes and it's the right moment in time, we met the right investors for our company who we all lined up. We were all from different places, but we all felt like there needed to be more than just this kind of faux organic stuff that was out there. And there needed to be something, and that biodynamic was different enough and unique enough and disciplined enough that it was an important thing to bring into our mix. And we always made the compost that way from day one. So, it's where our roots are, in terms of this company. It's where it's where we started. And, it's allowed us access into a lot of other worlds, by having something that's has very sound fundamental principles besides the woo-woo aspects of it. But there's a lot of really good old school ancient stuff that's involved in it too.
Do you think that the process of making biodynamic is what's important to you all, like going through that? Or do you think it actually is the amendments themselves that make the product different?
I think it's both. I think the preparations are really important, and I think composting the way we compost and the way we understand the material that we're working with now and the purity of the inputs, which is funny to say when you're dealing with an organic dairy cow manure, the purity of it, but there's a truth to that. So I think we now know our material really well. We know when we're putting the preps in, the timing of that, and everybody's a little different on how they do that. But we have, so part of what makes our compost unique to us is how we do it, is our process. And I think there's a thing too that when you're making compost, I wrote a piece on our website, on our blog, called "The Power of Compost," and it describes one morning when I walk onto the farm at about 5 a.m. and I'm seeing the heat rising off the compost, and I'm literally looking out over acres of compost, and I got into a very quiet space. When you feel that biology, when you feel that life, when you feel and you're working with a living soil, and you get to experience that. And then everybody who gets a bag, like if you just have the compost that you have at your house and you just literally held that compost in your hand for, 2 or 3 minutes, just hold it, see how it feels, see what you get from that. That experience on a huge level is what happened to me on that morning. I just wanted to describe it for everybody, so I did. But there's something about using living soil, and there's something about being connected. And so everybody that works in our company is like that. And, and everybody gets to come into the company at different points in time and different points of their growth, in their lives. And I've seen I've seen people, come in from, kind of enamored with it or not really quite knowing, and then just getting into the reality of it and the reality of a living soil and whether it's labeled biodynamic, regenerative, permaculture, whatever it is. Even if I wasn't labeled biodynamic, I would still, in knowing what I do, I would still be using the biodynamic preparations in making any compost that I would make.
Yeah, and this is kind of that gray area, I think, for a lot of gardeners and farmers. I think a lot of us, we want the science, we want that, but then we also do have that intuition, that sense of when you're doing something that you feel is important. And I don't know that there's a right answer anywhere in there, and I don't think anybody can pound the hammer and say this is the right answer. I think it's just got to fit in what you do. You can't go overboard on one hand spending money on stuff if you're not sure it's not going to work, and at the same time you don't want to starve your own kind of sense of exploration through this gardening and farming journey and not try things and do things that just kind of resonate with you, whether they're fully effective or not. And that's not to say that biodynamic isn't effective, but I think it does bridge that gray area between science and something else where it feels right for some people and for others it doesn't. And it's not breaking the bank or breaking your time bank for using it. So if you like it and you believe in it and it keeps you happy gardening, I say, why not?
I agree. I completely agree. And for me, I think there's a lot of great things. Steiner's Course in Agriculture, that's the book that came out of his lectures. It's a very interesting read. It's a tricky read, and for people that want to get more into it, it's there. For people that just want to go like, hey, these guys make, really good compost and my roses go insane every year when I, compost with it and then use their compost tea. And that's really all I want to know. I just want to have beautiful, and I'm okay either way. Everybody, it's nice to be in a situation where we can, offer something that's different, offer something that's not run of the mill, offer something that, I've taught now tens of thousands of people at gardening classes. And the responses I get back from people using the compost and when they first start using compost tea and it makes them get closer to their soil and makes them become more observant in their gardens and more observant on their small farms. And that's what's, to me, is really awesome and fascinating and wonderful, because then we get closer, they get closer. And I get a lot of responses back about how people start to see that transition and that change and what's good, what's tricky, but overall, I've never really had anybody say to me, yeah, I'm going to go back because I don't really, I don't like your methods.
I think compost tea is another one that's similar. Some people are totally on board with that. Some people say, like, I don't want to touch that. And I more lean towards, I see there's benefits to it. Why did you guys decide to put a compost tea product together, and why did you feel that that was necessary?
Well, for me, it happened. It made a lot of sense to me. A couple things happened to me. When I was a little kid, my grandmother in New Jersey used to take composted dairy cow manure and put it into a bucket and let it soak overnight, and she would feed her tomatoes. So I remembered that. And then one of the people that taught me how to make compost in the Central Valley. And it was a pretty long process. I had a landscape project that was a really big, one of my last big landscape projects that was going on in Malibu. And when I got onto this site, there was it was a 3-acre parcel that had myoporum hedges all around it, and about a third of the myoporum hedge was dying, and they were mature, big myoporum. And I was talking to one of the farmers one day, just, as we were out, on the weekend making compost and doing stuff. And I was just, saying, I got this hedge and it's like, I don't know, not really sure what I should do with this one, because to take it out and find mature to match to keep, privacy hedge in that area is going to cost a fortune. And they told me, why don't you, flush them with compost tea, and then why don't you make a tree paste, a biodynamic tree paste? And I'm like, I was a neophyte in this thing at that point. I'm like, okay, well, it's going to cost me a lot less money to try that to see what happens, right? Than to go charge these customers to take those myoporum out and put a new hedge in and do that. So we made tree paste, and I made my first compost teas, and we treated that hedge. And it was probably 2 to 3 weeks, and the dieback stopped. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. And we did another treatment a couple weeks after that, and that myoporum hedge is still there today. So I got to see it. My first, as an adult compost tea had a very dramatic effect that I could see with my own eyes. And so could the guys on my landscape crew. They were kind of like, they were thinking I was a little nuts. Like, maybe I'd gone off the reservation a little bit. And I was like, not, what's this guy doing now? Like, what is he doing? What is this crap we're putting out here? Right. And then they all became believers, just like I did.
That's a lot of things, I think, in gardening, right? Like, if you don't know a lot of it, if you're on the organic side and you're not spending tons of money up front, it doesn't hurt to try, experiment, and then see what types of results you get, and then make decisions based upon that going forward.
100%. 100%. I always tell people, you can always go back. You can always go back to what you were doing if you're not getting the results that you're looking for, or you don't see a change. I happen to see a change, and it's such a change, so profound that it's made me sell my landscape company and do Malibu Compost, and because I felt like people needed to have this option, which I don't think that they have had prior to us coming on. And I think, we've, in good ways, I think we've been a disruptor, from master gardeners to other soil companies to, all kinds of stuff, for me to just say, hey, all I do is use compost and compost tea and occasionally some minerals. And people are like, that's it? I'm like, that's it. That's what I do, and they're like, but how can that work? I'm like, well, it does, we're mimicking nature. Compost tea to me is like, you have all this, leaf litter and stuff drop, and little animals come by and poop and pee, and, and then it rains, and then you've got all this stuff that's broken down, in terms of leaf litter and leaf mold, and, and that stuff below that, seeps into the soil, seeps into the root level, into the rhizosphere, and those plants out in out in the forest, out in the savanna, out wherever, absorb it. So to me, a compost tea drench of an extract is a really simple, not stressful, form of biomimicry in a sense. To me, it makes a lot of sense, as does composting. Just makes a lot of sense to me. That's kind of what happened 8,000 years ago. is that, the first people to use fertilizer, it was manure, because where when they started, herding animals, they started to see where that manure was dropped, and they started to see fertility of soil because they had crops increase out of those, some of those old, ancient cereal crops and stuff like that were growing better where the animals, and naturally where the animals had been herded, and that was the whoa, the aha moment, for civilization, I guess, in that time.
And from a product differentiation standpoint, so you sell compost tea, like a little kit, along with bagged compost itself. If I buy a bag of your compost and I make tea with it, am I doing anything different than what I would get in a kit, or is a kit just a more convenient option for some people?
Well, the compost tea bags come four in a coffee sleeve. They come four tea bags. They're little organic cotton muslin bags. You drop each bag into 5 gallons of water, let them soak overnight, and then you give them a squeeze, then a stir. I look at it this way. Compost itself and composting and applying compost is much more, to me, like it's much more of the slow release and slow breakdown, where the biology is breaking that stuff down and bringing it into the soil. Whereas when you take a compost tea and make a compost tea, you are literally re-inoculating the soil with that biology. So you're feeding it, but you're also at root level getting your nutrients at root level for uptake. So with a compost tea versus other types of liquid fertilizers, a lot of that stuff flushes right through. If it's not uptaken by the plant, it gets flushed through, right? With a compost tea, because it's basically humus, suspended in liquid and tons of biology, lots of organic matter in there, it actually holds in the soil. And it actually either is taken up, or a lot of it, feeds other microbes in the soil, or some of it is used in that microscopic particulates as another food source for bacteria in the soil. So I love compost tea because of that, and I love simple teas. I mean, we do, so that's why we made our products where you don't have to aerate them. The compost tea, you don't have to do anything. You throw a tea bag in a bucket. I mean, I always do that like this, like it's going to be my great, reveal when I'm at my gardening classes for the beginner gardeners, where I'm going like, guys, I know most of you haven't used a compost tea. I'm going to show you how to do it. It's really hard, but just follow me. And I take a 5 gallon bucket of water and I open a coffee sleeve and I take a tea bag out and I drop it in there. I go, there you go. And they're like, that's it? I'm like, that's it.
Yeah. I think, again, it is part of the toolkit. Experiment with it, use it. Somebody can easily make that at home and do good things with their soil. Another product that you guys sell is potting mix. And I know this is really important to a lot of growers. They get a cult following around a lot of potting mixes. When it comes to a seed starting mix, what do you think is really important to have in there?
Okay, well, we make a seed starter. It's our newest product. It's a brand new product for us that started, it launched in February, right? And got into the stores right as this whole thing happened. Our seed starter is really simple. It's basically a mixture of peat and of coir. It's got 25% compost in it, and it's got some really small perlite in it. And it's a really good, airy, light mix. And the compost, which most seed starters don't have that in it, have any kind of real compost or casting in it. What it does is it helps hold moisture, and it helps germinate. And then once it germinates, you actually have, in a very natural way, a way for those little tiny roots to start to absorb stuff that it needs, whatever it needs to absorb. So we've had a really incredible result with it. We've been making it for several years. It's finally in a bag. It's also great as a microgreen grow. So I've got a bunch of microgreen growers that grow on a big scale that we've been using that mix for some time, and I grow a lot of microgreens at home here. And it's different from the potting soil, because with the potting soil, what we did is our potting soil, we were asked to go to create a super clean organic potting mix for Electronic Arts, who shared a campus with Google up in South San Francisco, because they were taking down, the landscapers were taking down a bunch of different stuff and creating kitchen gardens. So we created that mix. So we wanted to have something that was true organic, non-GMO, biodynamic, and that it had none of the usual suspects, or as few as possible in terms of soil mixes. So we didn't have the bone meal, the blood meal, the feather meal, none of the stuff that we don't believe in. And what we have in there is a really clean mix that gets tested all the time, and it's a really effective mix. That potting soil mix was designed to grow food, and it grows food really well. You can adjust that for other types of crops. You can adjust that. I grow roses in it. I grow fruit trees in it. I grow all kinds of stuff in it. And a lot of people grow cannabis in it. And depending on, they may add a little bit more perlite, they may, or pumice, or, whatever their strains or whatever they're doing, so it's a good mix that is a standalone mix. But it's one of those ones where I tell people all the time, you got to start feeding depending on what you're growing. It's not something where you're just going to put water on it and let it go for 6 months or 8 months or a year, because it's going to lose its efficacy, and you need to help that out. You need to help the soil out. It's a good start, potting soil.
Right. And I'm looking at the ingredients of that one online. That's Baby Boo's Biodynamic Blend potting soil, and that's a mix of coir, compost, the perlite, worm casting, soybean meal, fish bone meal, alfalfa meal, crab meal. So you are getting nutrients in that compost. They're just not coming from those CAFO operation type sources.
Yep. And what you're doing in there is we created this mix. So you have a really good, strong, diverse mix of natural fertilizers and the compost in a good media. And it gets everything off to a great start. Or if you're repotting stuff, it's got something that right away, boom. Like when we repot, fruit trees or roses or whatever in them that are in containers, they take to it immediately. But it's one of those things where then I tell people, like, great, I love that you're using Baby Boost, but now you got to start top dressing, with the 16th of an inch and 1/8 of an inch of compost. You got to start running compost teas. You need to keep, especially when you're looking at things in a container or a raised bed, we have to help play the part of nature when we're doing that. Because it's not like my raised beds have a dirt bottom, so I've got a lot of biology in there. But when you first start them, it doesn't just happen in 1 second. You have to build that, But when you're growing, in like when I grow my potatoes or other things that I grow just in containers, I have to be that person that's conscious about what would happen in nature and what do I do. And so by top dressing with compost, by running a tea, I'm in a really natural way and gentle way and not stressful way, giving the soil what it needs. So, and it makes the Baby Boos. One of the things that was really funny about the Baby Boos, we got a letter from the contractor on that site's a world famous landscape contractor. We got a letter from one of the vice presidents from their office in San Francisco that wrote back glowing reviews on the product. But he said one of the things that was the most interesting thing about this was that with most soils, we're having to, kind of come back in and fill up with a lot of soil, in every 4, 6, 8 months, because of what we were talking about with having all the wood chips and stuff in there that, with this stuff, basically, if you're top dressing with the compost or running the teas, the shrinkage factor, the breakdown factor is so much more natural. And, he said, granted that your product was a little bit more expensive than other things we've used, but in the long run, what you told us is true. It's not more expensive.
For a lot of growers who are out there looking to buy your compost or seed starting mix, potting mix, is the only way to get it in bags at nurseries? Can you buy in bulk? Can you get totes of it delivered? Anything like that?
Yeah, we don't do bulk, but we do totes. We have 2 cubic yard super sacks totes that are available. So we sell the potting soil and the compost in those as well. We have the 1 cubic foot bags of compost, the 1.5 cubic foot bags of potting soil. A lot of people buy by the pallet. A lot of places will give you deals on pallets. A lot of people, the deal is the best price is on the totes. We don't do for the stores and soil yards. We don't put our stuff out there for bulk because it really, you can really lose all the hard work you put into making that by having it put out in a place where it could get cross contaminated. It could, be sitting out in the sun on a asphalt soil yard, with all kinds of crap blowing into it and weed seeds blowing into it and all kinds of stuff. So we try to just bag up what we make. I mean, we have some vineyards and some other places that we make compost for that we will, they'll come in and we'll truck out to them right to the vineyard, and they're putting it right out. But other than that, we really don't do bulk.
Yeah. And for the sling bags, what's your delivery range on that?
Well, we have distributors all over the country, and so each of them carry it. So it just depends on. Some of them will go through their stores, and other of them actually are stores that are distributors too. So it just depends on who you're buying it from. You can always go online on our store locator and see who's got us. And if there's an issue or you have a question, we get thousands of questions every week on our website, and we respond.
Yeah, so people can look for that at malibukompost.com. And to start to close this one out, what's one takeaway that you want a listener or watcher to have when it comes to compost?
I would say that when you're using a compost, go out there and get the best compost you can get. Make compost at home. Realize that it is, in my opinion, and now I've been doing this for a long part of my life, 40 years of my life I've been doing this. It's, in my opinion, the most important thing that you can add or that you can do in terms of maintaining your garden. Good compost. And in my opinion, great compost. It's the home run. It's the grand slam. It makes all the difference in the world. And don't think, oh, this is expensive, because my grandmother used to say to me all the time, you get what you pay for. And she's pretty much right. I've learned over time that if I want something that's good, I generally buy the thing that's good. And usually it costs a little bit more than the next one or the next one down. But the one that's good is the one that lasts. And I've found that with my tools. I found that with, vehicles. I found that with tractors we bought. I've certainly found that with compost. I don't cheap out. I've learned my lesson, as we all have, I hope, in life. You learn that lesson, because when I cheap out, I just don't get what I need. And when you go ahead and use that good compost, then the compost, the things that you can do from it at home when you're making your own stuff, you get the benefit of that.
And I know just from talking to you, you are not just all here to sell compost. You're also a big advocate for people to make their own compost. And, one of the reasons you started the companies was sometimes people just can't make enough or a farm can't make enough. But you're not somebody who's saying, just buy ours. You also want people to make their own.
I want people to be self-sufficient. I want people to be in the soil. I want people to, if they want it, don't get me wrong. If they need compost, I want people to buy Malibu Compost. And that's why we work as hard as we do, and we're as diligent as we are, and we're as careful, and we're as conscious as we are about what we're making, and that anybody that buys us, I have a huge level of gratitude to the people that buy our stuff. When I walk into a store, if I walk into, let's say, Walter Anderson's nursery in San Diego, and I see Malibu Compost sitting there on a stack, and sitting there on a pallet, I always, to this day, get this overwhelming feeling of like, wow. And it's not about wow, like, wow, Randy, look what you did. Or wow, Randy, you and your guys are just so awesome. It's just, wow, like we're part of something that's bigger than us. And we're getting to, hopefully give a little bit of what we believe to people so that maybe they can give it to somebody else. And, that's the beauty, I think, of living where we live, is that you can vote with your wallet. You can support companies and people who are doing their best, for you, and I always look at it like I do that. And then the people out there, whatever it is that we've done and Malibu Compost has done, the return that we've gotten is so far greater. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about the return of love and of support and of kindness and of community. I could have never guessed this when we started. In a million years, I could have never guessed it.
It's really cool. You never see the ripple effects of the splash that you make sometimes. And that's cool. Thinking of the composting business, I took a PDC. I don't know if you have one of the things that like everybody who comes out of a PDC, like the most common business model that people want to start when it comes to permaculture is they want to start a composting business. And I've talked to a lot of growers who live in areas of the South and the Northeast where they can't find either a local source of compost or a good local source of compost. What advice would you have for somebody who wants to start a local composting business and try and do it better than some of the big soil yards?
Ooh. You got to stay convicted, because I can tell you one thing. When you go up against the big guys, right? You're going up against some multinational global corporations, and they're big, and they don't want you to succeed. And you're going to run into all kinds of pitfalls, and you have to be convicted with what you're doing. You have to have conviction. You have to believe in your heart that what you're doing is the best thing and it's the right course of action. And you can't let people turn you away or, switch your mind. Or, I've had so many people over the 11 years that we've had Malibu Compost say to me, well, why don't you guys do this? Or why don't you guys do that? Or why don't you add, food waste from restaurants into your stuff? And why don't you do that? And it's like, we do what we do, and we do very well. And we don't want to do that because that's not our wheelhouse, And we've had some rough times with weather, governmental control, other companies who, like to see you get hit by a bus, and you have to really, you gotta stand in that pocket. It's kind of like, I don't know if you surf, but but I know a lot of people can see the visualization of surfing. I grew up surfing, and when you surf big waves, or you surf waves that, let's say, are over 10 or 15 feet and they're pretty big, and all of a sudden you're paddling to catch that wave, all of a sudden there's a tug, and you have to go. once you're tugged into that wave, you're either going to stand up and go down that wave and surf that wave, or it's going to suck you over the falls. And if you're over a coral reef or a rock reef or who knows, bad stuff can happen. So you got to commit. So if you're going to start a compost company, you better be prepared to surf a lot of 20-foot waves.
Right. All in. Well, here's another thing. And we kind of talked about this briefly yesterday. And I think this is applicable to a lot of growers out there. You do what you do well. Most growers listening to this are trying to grow a premium product. Maybe that's livestock, maybe that's veg. They're not conventional. They're not the ones selling it at a discount. I have faced this problem. I know growers face this problem. When you have a premium product, sometimes the tendency can be like, my competitor charges $10 for a 2 cubic foot bag. We charge 15. Like, maybe I should be charging 13. And then you go to the bookkeeping side and you look at the numbers for 13 and you're like, that's not sustainable for us as a business. They're doing things differently at 10 than I'm doing things, how I'm doing things. I have to charge 15. How did you reconcile having the conviction to charge what you needed to charge, being a premium product, knowing that you're more expensive probably than a lot of your competitors, yet at the same time knowing that this is what you have to charge to be profitable now and to stay in business and get bigger long term?
That is probably one of the best questions I've ever been asked. Thank you. If you're going to be in business and you make something or you grow something that you believe in, then you have to be paid for your work, and your employees have to be paid for their work, and the people that are expecting your product to be on the shelves, or the distributors that are expecting to have their product there to take to market, it has to be there. And so you have to charge for that. And there is a value for that. And you have to look at what are your actual costs. So we're very realistic about this. So we look at what are our cost of goods. We look at what is a correct margin for us to be running so that our investors get a return on their investment. The people that work here get paid what they're worth, what their value is to be paid. And that's a fair value, that we don't, nobody in our company is driving around in, a $200,000 car, or, I'm not going to leave here today and get on my helicopter and fly up to the farm in California. When I go to the farm in California from where I live in Thousand Oaks, I get in my car and I have a Prius. I love my car. This is my third Prius. And not to make a statement, but just I love the car. It works. It functions. I've had other kinds of cars. I don't need that. I like what it functions for me. But we charge a fair price, and we're not afraid to charge it. And we're not afraid. We just did. When I get off this interview, I'm about to do a talk to a national distributor and all their reps, because we have a virtual trade show coming up, because the normal trade show is closed because of the coronavirus situation. I've raised my prices this year on several things, because we had last year we were having problems with oil, right? So we try to use as little plastic as possible. There's up prices in that. We had upticks in freight charges. There's a cost of doing business that can, generally goes up. We don't always hit that. We don't raise our prices a lot, but this year I raised our prices a little bit. And I'm not in fear in doing that. I know it's the right thing, and I know it's the truth. And so when you come out to people and you're just honest about it, and you're forthright, and you tell the truth, and I have no problem telling people, hey, you want the best compost in a bag out there in America? Go get a bag of Boost Blend. And that's not a sales pitch, guys. That's what I use, and that's what I have used on thousands and thousands of acres with great result. And and so don't be afraid. I look at this. I'm I'm a person of faith. Okay, I have faith. A lot of people don't. Whatever people's beliefs are okay. I believe in God. There's a thing that I believe is you can either be in faith or you can be in fear, but you cannot be in both of those places at the same time. I try to stay in faith as much as I can.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is somebody's going to come up to you and say, Randy, like that bag is too expensive. You're crazy. Like, if that was $8 a bag, I'd buy it all day. But at 15, I'm not going to touch it. And you have to be strong enough in yourself, in your own convictions, and knowing what you do to say, okay, that's your opinion. This isn't right for you. Try something else, but we're always here if you want to come back.
I've had to do that. And it sounds to me like you've had that same experience, because I literally have said to guys, okay, I don't need everybody on the planet to buy a bag of Malibu compost. If you're looking for something that's going to help you grow a true organic garden, it's there. It's available for you. If you're looking for ways to stretch it or extend it or use teas, or you're on a fixed budget and you need to work on how do I transition this garden, reach out to me. We try to help people achieve success, and sometimes it's little baby steps and sometimes it's big, boom, I'm jumping off the cliff with you guys. I've had that experience a lot of times where people were like, oh, and I go, I know. And a lot of times in my classes, I say to people like, so when you start organic, true organic, it's going to cost you more money in the very outset. But over time, you're not going to be using a lot of the stuff that you've been buying for years. And all of a sudden, when you look at year 2 or 3 or 4, your cost starts to drop and you go, wow, that crazy guy that taught that class, he actually told me the truth. That's the truth. And I said, I say, like, and if you're looking for ways to save money, you're looking for ways to be able to afford this, how many, soy chai lattes do we need? How many, there's always somewhere, especially in our culture where, are in America, where pretty much most people, that are, and I'm not saying people that are, we donate a lot of product to people that don't have money, or don't have enough income to be able to afford a product like ours. We work with the Edible Schoolyard Foundation. We do a lot of things like that. But for people that are working and are trying to grow a garden and are looking to buy products, I tell people, like, I look at, like, am I wasting money here? Is this something that I should be, using somewhere else, channeling this, this money that I've been giving to, a coffee place or this or that. And not that there's anything bad with having a cup of coffee or hanging out with your friends or a drink or whatever, that's okay. But sometimes we get into habits, we get habitual, and, and I find myself going like, wow, I just spent, $300, in the last 2 months at this place. Like,
or you start small, like you don't have to do it all at once.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm a lot of great insight in this one. I want to thank you for sharing your time today to talk about your company, and thank you for doing all the work that you're doing to help growers and gardeners out there grow better products and make an impact on the industry. So thanks again, Randy.
Really appreciate it, Diego. Thank you. Keep up the great work.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for watching. Subscribe here to get the latest from the show. Also, be sure to check out some of the great clips and watch the full interviews right here on In Search of Soil.